The mess hall buzzed with the usual evening chatter of soldiers unwinding after a long day of training. Steam rose from countless bowls of stew, while tired men and women in camouflage uniforms shared stories and complaints about their demanding officers. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across the long metal tables, where hundreds of service members gathered for their evening meal. Private Jake Morrison sat with his usual group near the back corner, his voice carrying louder than most as he entertained his buddies with exaggerated tales of his weekend adventures in town. At 22, Jake had been in the Army for barely 8 months, but he carried himself with the swagger of someone who thought he had it all figured out. His uniform was always slightly wrinkled, his boots never quite polished to regulation standard, and his attitude bordered on insubordinate. "You should have seen the look on that bartender's face when I told him I could drink him under the table," Jake boasted, gesturing wildly with his fork. His friends laughed, though some looked uncomfortable with his increasingly loud behavior. "These civilians don't know what real men look like until they meet us." Across the mess hall, near the serving line, stood someone Jake had never bothered to notice before. Captain Sarah Chen moved quietly through the evening routine, her plain clothes giving no indication of her rank or position. She had arrived at the base just 3 days earlier, transferred from a classified assignment overseas. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she wore civilian clothes as she observed the dining hall with careful, analytical eyes. Sarah had spent the last 5 years serving in some of the military's most challenging assignments. She had led troops through dangerous missions in hostile territory, earned 3 commendations for valor, and recently received a promotion that would soon change everything at this base. But tonight, she was simply trying to get a feel for the culture and morale of her new command. As she moved through the serving line, Sarah noticed the usual patterns that existed in every military dining facility she had ever visited. The quiet professionals who ate quickly and returned to their duties. The social groups that formed naturally among people who shared similar backgrounds or interests. The inevitable few who seemed to think military service was just an extended version of college fraternity life. Jake Morrison's voice cut through the ambient noise like a rusty blade. "The problem with this place is too many people taking themselves too seriously," he announced to his table, completely unaware that his words were carrying further than intended. "Half the officers around here probably never saw real action anyway, bunch of desk jockeys trying to act tough." Several soldiers at nearby tables shifted uncomfortably. They recognized the dangerous territory Jake was entering, but none felt it was their place to warn someone who seemed determined to dig his own grave. In military culture, respect for rank was not just tradition, but necessity. Units functioned on clear chains of command and mutual respect. Soldiers who consistently challenged authority rarely lasted long. Sarah heard every word, but her expression remained neutral. She had encountered countless soldiers like Jake throughout her career. Young, inexperienced, and convinced they understood military life better than anyone else. Usually, time and proper leadership would eventually teach them humility and respect. Sometimes, however, they needed a more direct lesson. With her tray loaded with the standard evening meal, Sarah began looking for a place to sit. The mess hall was crowded, and most tables were full. She spotted an empty chair at a table near Jake's group and began walking in that direction, still dressed in her civilian clothes and giving no obvious indication of her military status. Jake was in the middle of another story when he saw her approaching. In his mind, she was just another civilian contractor or possibly a family member visiting the base. Her quiet demeanor and modest appearance made her invisible to someone who only noticed people he considered important or impressive. "Excuse me," Sarah said politely, stopping beside an empty chair at the table next to Jake's group. "Would it be all right if I sit here?" The soldiers at that table immediately began to make room for her, their ingrained military courtesy evident in their quick response. But Jake, feeling emboldened by his audience and completely misreading the situation, decided this was an opportunity to demonstrate his supposed authority. "Actually, this section is reserved for military personnel," he said loudly, turning in his chair to face her. His friends looked mortified, but Jake continued with growing confidence. "You might be more comfortable in the civilian area near the front." The mess hall had no such designated sections, and everyone within earshot knew it. Sarah's eyebrows raised slightly, but she maintained her calm demeanor. "I see, and you're certain about these seating arrangements." Jake stood up, puffing out his chest in what he imagined was an intimidating display of authority. At 6 feet tall with a stocky build, he was used to people backing down when he adopted this aggressive posture. "Yeah, I'm certain. We have protocols here that civilians wouldn't understand." The conversation was beginning to draw attention from surrounding tables. Soldiers who had been focused on their meals were now watching the developing confrontation with growing concern. Several senior non-commissioned officers were beginning to take notice, their expressions suggesting they recognized that something very wrong was about to happen. Sarah set her tray down on the nearest table and turned to face Jake directly. Her posture remained relaxed, but something in her eyes should have warned him that he was making a serious mistake. "Protocols are important in military settings," she agreed quietly. "Perhaps you could explain to me which regulation establishes these particular seating arrangements." Jake felt trapped now, aware that he had made a claim he could not support but unwilling to back down in front of his friends. His pride overrode his common sense, and he decided to double down on his bluff. "Look, lady, I don't have time to explain military procedures to every civilian who wanders in here. Maybe you should talk to someone in charge if you have questions." The irony of his suggestion was lost on him, but not on the growing audience of soldiers who were beginning to realize they were witnessing something that would be discussed for years to come. Some were already reaching for their phones, sensing that they might want to document what happened next. Sarah smiled, and somehow that expression was more unsettling than any display of anger would have been. "Someone in charge. That's excellent advice, Private Morrison." Jake's face went pale. She knew his name, which meant she had access to information that civilians typically would not have. But he was too committed to his course of action to change direction now, even as warning bells began ringing in the back of his mind. "How do you know my name?" he demanded, his voice rising even higher. "Are you some kind of inspector or something?" "Something like that," Sarah replied, her tone remaining perfectly even. "But before we continue this conversation, I'm curious about something. In your 8 months of service, what exactly have you learned about respect for fellow service members?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a grenade. Everyone listening understood that this was no longer a simple misunderstanding about seating arrangements. This was about fundamental military values and the consequences of forgetting them. Jake's friends were now actively trying to signal him to stop talking, but he was beyond the point of noticing subtle warnings. His embarrassment was turning into anger, and he made the worst possible decision he could have made in that moment. "Listen here," he said, stepping closer to Sarah in what was clearly meant to be an intimidating gesture. "I don't know what your problem is, but you need to understand that this is a military base, and we have ways of dealing with people who don't show proper respect." The irony was so thick it could have been cut with a knife. Here was a soldier talking about respect while demonstrating a complete lack of it himself. But Jake was too deep in his own anger to see the contradiction. Sarah nodded thoughtfully, as if she was genuinely considering his words. "Ways of dealing with people who don't show proper respect. That's very interesting, Private Morrison. Tell me more about these methods." At a table across the room, Sergeant First Class Rodriguez was frantically trying to catch Jake's attention. Rodriguez had been watching the situation develop with growing horror, and he had a sinking feeling that he might know who the quiet woman in civilian clothes really was. 3 days earlier, he had been part of the advance team that had prepared quarters for a new commanding officer, someone whose reputation preceded them throughout the military. But Jake was oblivious to the warning signs that were visible to everyone else. He was completely focused on what he perceived as a challenge to his authority, never mind that he had no real authority to challenge. In his mind, he was defending his position and demonstrating leadership to his peers. "Well, for starters, civilians who cause problems can be escorted off base," he said with growing confidence. "Security takes these things pretty seriously around here." Sarah's expression remained neutral, but several people in the crowd could have sworn they saw the faintest hint of amusement in her eyes. "Security escorts for problematic civilians. I'll have to remember that. Have you had much experience coordinating with base security, Private Morrison?" The question was delivered so smoothly that Jake completely missed the trap being set for him. "Enough to know how things work around here," he boasted. "Some of us take our responsibilities seriously." At that moment, the mess hall doors opened, and in walked Colonel Patricia Williams, the base executive officer. She was making her usual evening rounds, checking on facilities and morale throughout the installation. But when she saw the crowd gathered around one particular area, and when she recognized the figure at the center of attention, her expression changed dramatically. Colonel Williams began walking rapidly toward the confrontation, her mind racing as she tried to figure out how to minimize what was clearly about to become a career-ending disaster for at least one soldier. She had been briefed about the new commanding officer who had arrived earlier that week, and she knew that this situation was about to become much worse than anyone present could imagine. But before she could reach the group, Jake made his final, catastrophic mistake. Frustrated by what he perceived as the woman's stubborn refusal to be intimidated, and encouraged by what he mistakenly thought was the support of his watching colleagues, he decided to end the confrontation with a display of physical authority. "You know what, I think this conversation is over," he announced loudly. "You need to leave this area right now, and if you don't, I'm going to have to make you leave." The mess hall had gone completely silent now. Even soldiers who had been at distant tables were now watching the unfolding disaster. Everyone seemed to understand that they were witnessing something that would be remembered long after Jake Morrison was gone from the base. Sarah looked around at the watching faces, then back at Jake. Her voice remained calm and professional as she delivered her response. "Private Morrison, I want to make sure I understand your position correctly. You're saying that you have the authority to remove people from this facility by force if they don't comply with your directions." "That's exactly what I'm saying," Jake replied, his chest puffed out with false confidence. "And right now I'm directing you to leave." Colonel Williams was now running toward the scene, her face a mask of professional horror as she realized she was not going to reach them in time to prevent the catastrophe that was about to unfold. Sarah nodded slowly, as if she was carefully considering Jake's ultimatum. "I see. Well, Private Morrison, I appreciate you clarifying your understanding of military authority and chain of command. It's going to make the next few minutes much more educational for everyone involved." Jake had no idea what she meant by that, but something in her tone finally penetrated his anger enough to make him hesitate. For the first time since the confrontation began, he looked around and really noticed the expressions on the faces watching him. Instead of the support and admiration he had expected, he saw horror, embarrassment, and something that looked very much like pity. But it was too late to change course now. He had committed himself to a path of action, and his pride would not let him back down, even as every instinct he possessed began screaming warnings that he was making a terrible mistake. Sarah reached into her pocket and pulled out a simple leather wallet. "Before this goes any further, Private Morrison, I think there's something you should see." The leather wallet opened to reveal a military identification card, but Jake was too angry and embarrassed to focus on the details. All he could see was what looked like some kind of official documentation, which only reinforced his assumption that this woman was some sort of civilian contractor or inspector trying to throw her weight around. "Great, another bureaucrat with a badge," Jake muttered, his voice dripping with disdain. "I don't care what kind of civilian clearance you have, the rules are still the rules." The soldiers closest to the confrontation began backing away slowly, their faces pale with recognition of what Jake was missing. Sergeant Rodriguez had gone completely white and was frantically gesturing for Jake to stop talking, but Jake was too focused on his perceived victory to notice. Sarah held the identification card steady, her voice remaining perfectly calm. "Take a closer look, Private Morrison. I want to make sure you understand exactly who you're addressing." Jake glanced at the card dismissively, his brain still too clouded by anger and pride to process what he was seeing. The photograph showed the same woman standing in front of him, but she was wearing a dress blue uniform with more ribbons and insignia than he had ever seen on one person. His eyes skimmed over the details without really comprehending their significance. "Look, whatever your rank was before you became a civilian consultant, it doesn't matter here," Jake said with growing irritation. "This is a working military base, not some Pentagon office where people get impressed by old credentials." Colonel Williams finally reached the edge of the crowd, pushing through the gathered soldiers with barely controlled panic. She could see the identification card from where she stood, and she knew exactly what it contained. More importantly, she knew what was about to happen to Private Morrison's military career. "Morrison," she called out sharply, but her voice was lost in the general noise of the mess hall and Jake's continued rant. "You know what I think," Jake continued, his voice getting louder as he warmed to his theme. I think you're just some washed-up former soldier who can't handle the fact that the real military has moved on without you. Maybe it's time you accepted that your glory days are over and found something more appropriate for a civilian to do with her time. The gathered crowd collectively held its breath. Several junior officers in the group were visibly cringing, knowing that they were witnessing what would probably become the most spectacular case of career suicide in the base's recent history. Sarah listened to every word with the patience of someone who had dealt with much more dangerous enemies than an overconfident private. Her expression remained neutral, but those who knew her well would have recognized the slight tightening around her eyes that indicated her complete assessment of the situation. "Former soldier," she repeated thoughtfully. "That's an interesting perspective, Private Morrison. Tell me, what makes you so confident about my current status?" Jake waved his hand dismissively at the identification card she was still holding. "Because real soldiers don't wander around military facilities in civilian clothes, trying to intimidate people with expired credentials. Real soldiers understand chain of command and respect for authority." The irony was so profound that several people in the crowd exchanged glances of disbelief. Here was a private who had shown no respect for anyone since the confrontation began, lecturing someone else about military values. Colonel Williams was now close enough to intervene, but she hesitated, knowing that anything she said might only make Jake's situation worse. There was a protocol for these situations, and unfortunately, that protocol required letting Jake finish digging his own grave before anyone could help him out of it. Sarah carefully placed her identification back in her wallet and returned it to her pocket. "You're absolutely right about the importance of chain of command, Private Morrison. It's one of the fundamental principles that makes military organizations function effectively." Jake nodded vigorously, convinced that he was finally getting through to her. "Exactly. And part of that chain of command means understanding your place and respecting the people who have earned their positions through actual service." "Actual service," Sarah repeated, her tone remaining perfectly even. "What would you consider to be examples of actual service, Private Morrison?" Jake puffed up with pride, seeing an opportunity to demonstrate his superior understanding of military culture. "Combat deployments, leading troops under fire, making the hard decisions that civilian contractors never have to face. The kind of experience that earns you the right to speak with authority in places like this." Several of the watching soldiers were now covering their faces with their hands, unable to watch the continuing disaster. Others were recording the incident with their phones, knowing that they were documenting something that would become legendary throughout the military. Sarah nodded thoughtfully, as if she was genuinely considering his words. "Those are indeed important qualifications. And in your 8 months of service, how much combat experience have you accumulated, Private Morrison?" The question caught Jake off guard. He had been expecting her to be intimidated by his lecture about military values, not questioned about his own credentials. "Well, I'm still in training," he admitted reluctantly. "But at least I'm a real soldier, not some civilian pretending to understand military culture." "Still in training," Sarah observed. "So your extensive knowledge of military protocol and chain of command comes from 8 months of basic training and initial assignments." Jake's face reddened as he realized she was questioning his qualifications, but his pride would not let him back down. "I've learned enough to recognize when someone doesn't belong," he said defiantly. "And you clearly don't belong in the military section of this facility." At that moment, Master Sergeant Patricia Hayes entered the mess hall through the side entrance. She was making her evening rounds when she heard about some kind of disturbance in the dining area. As the senior non-commissioned officer on duty, it was her responsibility to investigate and resolve any conflicts. But when she saw who was at the center of the confrontation, her professional composure nearly cracked. She recognized Sarah Chen immediately, having been part of the command briefing about the new general who would be taking over the base in just 2 days. The same general who was currently being lectured about military protocol by a private with less than a year of service. Master Sergeant Hayes began pushing through the crowd, knowing she had to intervene before Jake said something that would end not just his career, but potentially damage the reputation of everyone associated with him. But Jake was on a roll now, convinced that he was winning the argument. "You know what the real problem is here?" Jake continued, his voice carrying across the now silent mess hall. It's people like you who think you can waltz into military facilities and demand respect without earning it. The soldiers here work hard every day to maintain the standards and traditions of this service, and we don't appreciate outsiders trying to disrupt that. Sarah listened to every word with the patience of someone who had commanded troops in actual combat situations. Her training had taught her to remain calm under pressure, much more severe than anything a confused private could generate. Standards and traditions, she repeated. Those are certainly important concepts. What would you say is the most important tradition in military service, Private Morrison? Jake sensed another opportunity to demonstrate his supposed expertise. Respect for rank and authority, he declared confidently. Understanding that some people have earned the right to make decisions while others need to follow orders. And how does one typically earn that right? Sarah asked, her tone suggesting genuine curiosity about his answer. Jake gestured broadly at the gathered soldiers, most of whom were trying very hard to avoid eye contact with him. Through years of dedicated service, combat experience, and proving yourself capable of leadership under pressure. The kind of things that take time to develop and can't be faked. Master Sergeant Hayes finally reached the inner circle of the confrontation, but before she could speak, Sarah turned to look directly at her. The brief eye contact between the two was enough to communicate that Sarah wanted to let this situation play out to its natural conclusion. Hayes understood immediately. As much as she wanted to save Jake from himself, she recognized that this was becoming an important teaching moment for everyone present. Sometimes the most effective lessons in military discipline came from allowing soldiers to experience the full consequences of their choices. Sarah turned back to Jake with an expression of polite interest. Years of dedicated service and combat experience. That's a very comprehensive answer, Private Morrison. I'm curious about something, though. In your opinion, how should a soldier respond when they encounter someone with significantly more experience and authority than themselves? Jake's confidence was beginning to waver slightly, but he was too committed to change course now. With respect, he said, though his voice lacked its earlier conviction. But that respect has to be mutual. Real leaders don't need to hide behind civilian clothes and try to trick people. Trick people, Sarah repeated thoughtfully. Is that what you think is happening here? I think you're testing us or something, Jake said, his anger beginning to mix with uncertainty. Maybe you're some kind of inspector checking to see if we follow proper procedures. Well, I've got news for you. We take security seriously here, and we don't let unauthorized personnel disrupt our operations. The gathered crowd was now so quiet that every word could be heard clearly throughout the mess hall. Soldiers at distant tables had stopped eating and were straining to listen to the extraordinary confrontation taking place. Colonel Williams had finally reached the front of the group, and her presence immediately added a new dynamic to the situation. Her arrival was noticed by everyone except Jake, who was too focused on his argument with Sarah to pay attention to anything else. Private Morrison, Colonel Williams said quietly, but with unmistakable authority. Jake glanced over at her briefly, recognizing her rank but not understanding why she was interrupting his conversation. Yes, ma'am. I'm just handling a situation with an unauthorized civilian in the dining facility. Colonel Williams closed her eyes briefly, knowing that Jake was about to make his situation infinitely worse. Private Morrison, I need you to stop talking and listen very carefully to what I'm about to tell you. But Jake was beyond the point of taking good advice. His pride and embarrassment had combined into a toxic mixture that clouded his judgment completely. With respect, ma'am, I think I can handle one civilian contractor who's gotten a little too big for her britches. The phrase hit the silent mess hall like a physical blow. Even soldiers who had been trying to give Jake the benefit of the doubt were now staring in horrified amazement at his complete lack of situational awareness. Sarah's expression finally changed slightly, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. It was not a particularly warm smile, but rather the expression of someone who had just seen a situation develop exactly as they had predicted it would. Too big for my britches, she repeated quietly. That's a colorful way to describe the situation, Private Morrison. Before we continue, though, I want to make sure I understand your position completely. You believe that I am a civilian contractor who has no authority in this facility and should be removed by force if necessary. That's exactly what I believe, Jake said firmly, his voice carrying clearly across the room. And I'm prepared to back up that belief with action if you continue to disrupt our dinner and disrespect our facility. Master Sergeant Hayes stepped forward then, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. Private Morrison, you are hereby ordered to stand at attention and remain silent until further notice. The command was delivered with the kind of authority that Jake had been trained to respond to automatically. Despite his confusion and anger, 8 months of military conditioning caused him to snap to attention without thinking. But even as his body followed the familiar command, his mind was still racing with resentment and confusion. He stood rigid at attention, his eyes focused straight ahead, but his expression made it clear that he still believed he had been in the right. Sarah looked around at the gathered crowd, then back at Jake's rigid figure. "Thank you, Master Sergeant Hayes. I think Private Morrison and I have had a very educational conversation." She paused for a moment, allowing the silence to build tension throughout the room. "However, there seems to be some confusion about my status and authority in this facility. Perhaps it's time to clear that up." Colonel Williams stepped forward, her face a mask of professional composure that barely concealed her personal horror at what she had witnessed. "Ma'am, if I may." "Of course, Colonel Williams," Sarah replied, her tone suddenly carrying an undertone of unmistakable command authority. "Please, proceed with the introduction that should have happened 3 days ago." The words hit the assembled soldiers like a physical force. The implications were clear to everyone except Jake, who was still standing at rigid attention and trying to process what he was hearing. Colonel Williams cleared her throat and spoke in the formal tone reserved for the most serious military occasions. "Ladies and gentlemen, I have the honor to introduce General Sarah Chen, who will assume command of this installation in 48 hours. The mess hall erupted in a flurry of movement as soldiers throughout the room leaped to their feet and snapped to attention. The sound of chairs scraping against the floor and boots hitting the deck in unison echoed throughout the facility. Everyone was at attention now except for Jake, whose rigid posture suddenly took on an entirely different meaning. The confident soldier who had been lecturing a general about military protocol was now standing frozen in place, his mind struggling to process the magnitude of his mistake. General Chen looked around the room at the assembled soldiers, then back at Jake's pale figure. "At ease, everyone except Private Morrison. Private Morrison will remain at attention until I dismiss him personally." The mess hall remained unnaturally quiet as General Chen walked slowly around Jake's rigid figure, her footsteps echoing in the silence. Every soldier present understood they were witnessing military justice in its rawest form, and none wanted to miss a single moment of what would become legendary throughout the armed forces. "Private Morrison," General Chen began, her voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. "In the past 15 minutes, you have provided me with an extraordinary demonstration of everything that is wrong with military discipline when it is not properly understood or respected." Jake's face had gone completely white, but military protocol required him to remain silent unless directly asked a question. Sweat was beginning to form on his forehead as the full magnitude of his situation finally penetrated his consciousness. "You have lectured a superior officer about chain of command while demonstrating complete ignorance of that very concept," the general continued, her tone remaining perfectly professional. "You have questioned the qualifications of someone with 15 years of active combat experience while boasting about your own 8 months of basic training." She stopped directly in front of him, close enough that he could see the numerous campaign ribbons and decorations that he had dismissed so casually minutes earlier. Each ribbon represented deployments, operations, and commendations that Jake could barely comprehend. "You have threatened to physically remove a general officer from a military facility while claiming to protect that facility's security," General Chen continued. "And you have done all of this in front of approximately 200 witnesses who will remember your performance for the rest of their careers." Colonel Williams stepped forward, her voice carefully controlled. "General, if I may suggest that Private Morrison's actions might be attributed to inexperience rather than malicious intent." General Chen held up a hand, stopping the colonel's attempt at damage control. "Colonel Williams, I appreciate your concern for Private Morrison's welfare. However, inexperience does not excuse the fundamental lack of respect and judgment we have witnessed here tonight." She turned back to Jake, who was still standing rigidly at attention but clearly struggling with the enormity of his mistake. "Private Morrison, I want you to understand something very clearly. Your behavior tonight was not simply inappropriate or embarrassing. It was a fundamental violation of the trust that the military places in every soldier who wears the uniform. Master Sergeant Hayes stood nearby, her expression grim as she watched the systematic dismantling of Jake's military career. She had seen many young soldiers make serious mistakes, but nothing quite as spectacular as what had just unfolded. The military functions on the principle that soldiers can be trusted to recognize authority and respond appropriately, even in unfamiliar situations, General Chen continued. Your actions tonight have demonstrated that you either cannot or will not exercise the basic judgment required for military service. She paused, allowing her words to sink in throughout the silent mess hall. More concerning than your specific mistakes, however, is the attitude that led to those mistakes. You have shown contempt for what you perceived as civilian authority, disrespect for military protocol, and a willingness to use physical intimidation when you didn't get your way. Jake's legs were beginning to shake slightly from the strain of maintaining his rigid posture, but he knew better than to move without permission. Every second of his current ordeal was being burned into his memory with painful clarity. Private Morrison, General Chen said, her voice taking on a slightly different tone. I'm going to ask you a direct question, and I expect a complete and honest answer. Do you understand why your behavior tonight was unacceptable? Yes, ma'am, Jake replied, his voice barely above a whisper. Explain it to me, she ordered. Jake swallowed hard, knowing that his next words would determine whether he had any chance of salvaging his military career. Ma'am, I failed to show proper respect to a superior officer. I made assumptions about your status without verifying the facts. I threatened to use force against someone I should have recognized as my commanding officer. General Chen nodded slowly. Those are the specific violations, Private Morrison, but I asked you to explain why your behavior was unacceptable. The why goes much deeper than simply listing your mistakes. Jake's mind raced as he tried to understand what she was looking for. The silence stretched on as he struggled to find words that would adequately express his understanding of the situation. Ma'am, he began hesitantly, I think my behavior was unacceptable because it showed that I don't really understand what it means to be a soldier. I was so concerned with looking important and demonstrating authority that I forgot the most basic principles of military service. Continue, General Chen ordered. Ma'am, I showed disrespect for the chain of command, which is the foundation of military organization. I made judgments about people based on appearances rather than giving them the benefit of the doubt. And I let my pride override my common sense, which could have dangerous consequences in a real military situation. General Chen listened to every word, her expression revealing nothing about whether she found his explanation adequate. And what do you think those dangerous consequences might be, Private Morrison? Jake's voice grew stronger as he began to understand the full implications of his actions. Ma'am, if I can't recognize authority and respond appropriately in a mess hall, how can I be trusted to follow orders in combat? If I'm willing to physically threaten someone I disagree with, how can my fellow soldiers trust me to have their backs in dangerous situations? The general nodded approvingly. You're beginning to understand, Private Morrison. Military discipline is not about blindly following rules. It's about developing the judgment and character necessary to function effectively in life-and-death situations. She turned to address the gathered soldiers, her voice carrying clearly throughout the mess hall. Everyone here tonight has witnessed an important lesson about military values and their practical applications. Private Morrison's mistakes were not simple errors in protocol. They were failures of character and judgment that strike at the heart of what makes military organizations effective. The assembled soldiers listened intently, understanding that they were receiving instruction that would serve them throughout their careers. This was not just about Jake's punishment, but about reinforcing the fundamental principles that held their entire organization together. The military cannot function when soldiers decide for themselves which orders to follow and which authorities to respect, General Chen continued. We cannot accomplish our mission when pride and ego override common sense and humility, and we cannot protect each other when individual soldiers believe they are above the standards that apply to everyone else. She walked back to stand directly in front of Jake, who was still maintaining his rigid position despite the obvious strain. Private Morrison, Your actions tonight have consequences that extend far beyond your personal embarrassment. They have damaged the morale and cohesion of your unit, wasted the time and energy of multiple senior officers, and created a situation that will require significant effort to resolve. Colonel Williams stepped forward again, knowing that the moment for any kind of intervention was rapidly passing. General, Private Morrison is still in his initial training period. Perhaps there might be an opportunity for additional instruction and rehabilitation rather than— Colonel Williams, General Chen interrupted firmly, I understand your desire to protect a young soldier's career. However, we must consider whether Private Morrison has demonstrated the fundamental character traits necessary for military service. She turned back to Jake, her expression serious but not entirely unsympathetic. Private Morrison, I'm going to give you an opportunity that most soldiers in your situation would never receive. I'm going to allow you to make a choice about your future in the military. Jake's heart began pounding as he realized that his career was hanging in the balance. Whatever choice she was about to offer him would determine whether he remained in the army or returned to civilian life in disgrace. You can choose to accept full responsibility for your actions tonight and submit to a comprehensive retraining program that will address your attitude and judgment problems, General Chen explained. This program will be intensive, demanding, and will place you under constant supervision for the next 6 months. She paused to let the first option sink in before continuing. Alternatively, you can request a discharge under other than honorable conditions and return to civilian life immediately. This would end your military career, but would spare you and the Army the extended process of determining whether you can be successfully rehabilitated. The choice was stark and uncompromising. Jake could attempt to salvage his military career through intensive rehabilitation, or he could cut his losses and leave immediately with a damaged reputation, but without further consequence. Private Morrison, General Chen said, you have 1 minute to decide. Choose carefully because this decision will affect the rest of your life. Jake's mind raced as he considered his options. The intensive retraining program would be humiliating and difficult, but it would give him a chance to prove that he could learn from his mistakes. The discharge would be easier in the short term, but it would mean giving up on his military ambitions entirely. Ma'am, Jake said finally, his voice steady despite his obvious nervousness, I request permission to enter the retraining program. I understand that I have made serious mistakes, but I believe I can learn from them and become a better soldier. General Chen studied his face for a long moment, looking for any sign of insincerity or hidden resentment. Private Morrison, if I approve your request for retraining, you will be under constant evaluation. Any sign that you are not genuinely committed to changing your attitude and behavior will result in immediate discharge. Yes, ma'am, I understand completely. Furthermore, she continued, you will be required to write a detailed analysis of tonight's events and present it to every new soldier who arrives at this base for the next year. You will explain exactly what you did wrong and why, and you will answer any questions they might have about military protocol and respect for authority. The additional requirement was clearly designed to ensure that Jake's mistake would serve as a learning opportunity for other soldiers. It would be humiliating, but it would also force him to think deeply about his actions and their consequences. Yes, ma'am, I accept all conditions of the retraining program. General Chen nodded slowly, then turned to address Master Sergeant Hayes. Master Sergeant, Private Morrison is hereby placed in your custody for the purpose of intensive retraining and attitude adjustment. He will report to you at 500 hours tomorrow morning for the beginning of his rehabilitation program. Yes, ma'am, Master Sergeant Hayes replied crisply. Private Morrison will receive my full attention. The way she emphasized the word, full, suggested that Jake's next 6 months would be more challenging than anything he had experienced in his military career so far. But it also implied that he would receive genuine instruction and mentorship from one of the Army's most experienced non-commissioned officers. General Chen looked around the mess hall one final time, her gaze taking in the faces of all the soldiers who had witnessed the evening's events. Ladies and gentlemen, you have seen tonight what happens when military discipline breaks down and what happens when it is properly restored. I expect that everyone present will remember these lessons and apply them throughout their careers. She turned back to Jake, who was still standing at rigid attention despite his obvious exhaustion. Private Morrison, you are dismissed to report to Master Sergeant Hayes for initial counseling. Your retraining program begins immediately. Yes, ma'am. Thank you, ma'am, Jake replied, his voice filled with genuine gratitude for the second chance he had been given. As Jake finally relaxed from his rigid posture and followed Master Sergeant Hayes toward the exit, the mess hall began to buzz with quiet conversation as soldiers processed what they had witnessed. The story would spread throughout the base within hours and throughout the entire military within days. General Chen picked up her meal tray and found a seat at an empty table, her casual demeanor returning as if nothing unusual had happened. But everyone present understood that they had just witnessed a master class in military leadership and justice. Colonel Williams approached her table, still looking somewhat shaken by the evening's events. General, that was educational. It was necessary, General Chen replied simply, taking a bite of her meal. Private Morrison needed to learn that actions have consequences, and everyone else needed to see that military standards apply equally to everyone. As the evening progressed and the mess hall gradually returned to normal, Jake Morrison began the most difficult period of his military career. But he also began a process of genuine growth and development that would eventually transform him into the kind of soldier he should have been from the beginning. The story of his spectacular mistake and subsequent redemption would become part of base legend, serving as both a warning and an inspiration to countless future soldiers. And General Chen's handling of the situation would establish her reputation as a leader who demanded excellence, but also believed in the possibility of genuine change. In the end, Jake's foolish moment of pride had cost him dearly, but it had also provided him with an opportunity for growth that few soldiers ever receive. Whether he would make the most of that opportunity remained to be seen, but the foundation for his transformation had been laid in the most public and memorable way possible.